each, if that's okay. I would at the start just register the point with the government and the minister that it was very poor form in terms of not having enough TDs from the government side here to be able to start our work, in particular considering this is government legislation. I'm not sure Deputy Burton was best placed to make that point, given that she was here maybe for a couple of minutes and then left and didn't contribute to the quorum, and the same as her Labour Party colleagues. But I don't think we're here for 20 minutes, but we can look at the clock. Well, but that's fine. We can look at the clock. It doesn't matter. The point is mostly for the government. I agree. Thanks a lot.
Could we attend to the legislation maybe rather than have the chit chat later?
Yeah, thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I think it's important that we discuss this legislation. We don't just rerun old battles from the election about who was right, about bank bailouts or whatever. We have important legislation to discuss. I think that we agree and we accept. Sorry. Thanks. We accept and agree with the proposal from the government in terms of the amendments, because we want to see the Commission of Investigation empowered to do its work effectively, to get over the barriers that Judge Cregan has identified as quickly as is possible, and in particular to report as quickly as is possible on the question of the Siteserv transactions. I do think an important point here for discussion is about why have we needed to make this change. However long after we originally set this up, the points were raised originally by the judge in November, and now we are making this change here. A journalist called Brian Carey in the Sunday Times raised the questions better than I could, I think. He wrote, "For all the world, the inquiry into loan write-offs at IBRC looks like it was built to collapse. The towering edifice, the flimsy foundation, the complex material, the entirely infeasible completion deadline. It ran out of control well before it was due to begin. By estimating a duration of several years, Judge Brian Cregan first rendered the whole prospect outrageous. It was the government's decision to broaden the probe to 38 transactions and losses to the State Bank of more than 10 million. Now the government claims that an investigation could cost as much as a tribunal. There never were grounds for a probe of that scope, depth, length or expense, nor was one ever demanded. And so the public's quest for truth runs aground in a legal quagmire of confidentiality, privilege and enormous expenses. How convenient. There were only ever a handful of questions that begged answers in this affair. Did Denis O'Brien, the most powerful businessman in the country, receive preferential treatment in his dealings with IBRC? Was he unduly favoured in his purchase of Siteserv, a utilities service company which was heavily indebted to the bank? Did he get preferential rates of interest on his own personal borrowings? KPMG could review, as suggested by Cregan, the top 12 write-offs, provided once again that there is no conflict of interest. It is the job of a liquidator to investigate the affairs of a bust company. As yet, the evidence is not there to justify a wide-ranging, lengthy and expensive judicial inquiry. Frankly, the public should be aghast that one should take place without at least establishing a case for such a probe. By the same token, the Siteserv issue should not be buried with this administration. Right now, this looks like a manufactured botch job. And you could accuse him in normal circumstances of, extreme cynicism, believing in conspiracy theories, etc., to believe that what we have here is a manufactured botch job. And that certainly would be the case if we were to take what the Minister outlined in terms of saying that he wants to reiterate that the government shares with the rest of the House a desire to ensure that there is an effective, efficient and timely investigation into the issues of significant public concern which have been raised in relation to the IBRC. But the problem is that statement does not tally with the actions of the government, in particular with the actions of Minister Noonan, because far from establishing this Commission of Investigation in a timely, quick manner, giving it the appropriate powers to do the work that it had to do, and giving it a certain terms of reference in terms of what it's trying to establish. Actually, this was dragged out of the government kicking and screaming in reality. Famously, we know that 19 questions were asked of Minister Noonan by Deputy Murphy, and failed to get answers in relation to that. We know that the Minister effectively engaged in deliberate attempts to bury the issue, claiming in answer to the 19 questions that there was nothing wrong with the Siteserv deal, that the board of IBRC was happy, but never mentioning that his own department had questions. We know that he attended a meeting in July 2012 between the department and the board of IBRC where the sale was discussed, and that the department there had raised serious concerns about the way Siteserv was sold. He had the opportunity at that stage to order an inquiry when he knew about the problems, but he obviously didn't do so. Then we had, over a number of weeks of the Dáil, we had the government under pressure, then the KPMG investigation, and then eventually this dragged out of them, kicking and screaming. So I think the question raised by Brian Kerry, it's not an unreasonable question to raise. The essence of the matter here for us, and what needs to be investigated as quickly and as thoroughly as is possible, and what is at the heart of this, is obviously the Siteserv transaction. The consequences of it is that the taxpayer picked up a bill for €119 million. On the other side, Denis O'Brien got a licence effectively to print money through the imposition of water meters. And the board of Siteserv, in the process of the sale, was allowed to conduct the sale instead of IBRC, which was tasked with getting the best return for the state. The board, we know, decided to exclude trade sales and instead entered into an exclusivity deal with one buyer, Denis O'Brien. We know that the board of Siteserv decided to reject higher bids for the company, and we know that their shareholders got a €5 million payout for what was a bankrupt company. And we also know that many of the directors of the company who conducted the sale were also shareholders, and that Arthur Cox acted both for the buyer and for the seller, and that KPMG and Davy stockbrokers acted as advisors for the sale, despite many of the Siteserv board having links to KPMG and many of the shareholders who got the €5 million being clients of Davy stockbrokers. So that's effectively the very central issues that we need investigated. They aren't all that complicated in reality, despite the fact that we had stonewalling from the minister previously. There is another side of this transaction that I think, or the things around Siteserv that I think needs to be investigated. It obviously won't be investigated by this commission. It's outside the terms of reference of this commission. But it's more fundamentally the point about why did Denis O'Brien buy a bust company in a field in which he had no experience, and did he do so in the expectation that he would then be able to, as part of GMC Sierra, be able to get the water metering contract. So that isn't included here because it's limited to the question of the write-offs in terms of IBRC. But for me, it's an important part of the story here, and there's obviously two sides, two parts of that story. Obviously, we know that Bord Gáis told the government, Bord Gáis was responsible for the decision in relation to water meters. They told the government it was unnecessary to install the meters before the charges came in. But nonetheless, the minister responsible, who was Phil Hogan, decided to push ahead with the water metering. We also know a number of meetings happened behind closed doors, including two that involved the former minister, Phil Hogan. We know that Mike Ainsley, on the 26th of April of last year, said that the existence of the water metering tender was known, as was the likelihood of Siteserv bidding, and the knowledge that should it be successful, the value of the company will be enhanced. He said that on the 26th of April, whereas Alan Dukes on the 24th of April said the sale took place over 2 years before there was any discussion of a public contract for the installation of water meters. So there are further questions to be asked there. The fundamental point is that what has happened here is not victimless, nor is it winnerless. There are those who won from this series of transactions. The Siteserv shareholders benefited, Denis O'Brien benefited, the firms that were paid fees to oversee the process benefited, and the losers were obviously the public. And it gets to the heart, and I think that's why it's a sensitive issue from the point of view of the government, of how Irish capitalism operates, particularly Irish capitalism in the, let's say, so-called post-bailout environment, where write-offs have come to the fore as a mechanism for transferring of public wealth to private individuals, and in particular the question of Denis O'Brien's relationships to media, to politics, and what that demonstrates about how society actually operates, how the 1% work in practice. Obviously, this commission has the potential to unveil aspects of how that relationship unveil aspects of how people are able to make substantial amounts of money. We need to look at that. And it also takes place in the context, I think it's been mentioned by others, of an individual who is extremely litigious, who has used legal action or the threat of legal action against this Dáil to prevent the Dáil discussing certain matters, against media outlets that attempted to report in line with the Constitution, things that were said, utterances that were made in this Dáil, against a satirical website, Waterford Whispers, for having a joke. And it's clearly an attempt to chill discussion in public, in the media, so that these things aren't discussed and don't come out. The final very general point is that point about winners and losers and about write-offs. I think it has a relevance in terms of the points that Deputy Donnelly raised yesterday, that we had this situation where we had massive bailouts at the cost, again, of the taxpayer, with the result of institutions like the IBRC. And then, in effect, what is happening is there's a second round of bailouts happening, or a second round of transference of wealth to certain private individuals by the state through the mechanism of write-offs. That's what's happening. And it was striking whenever this controversy arose. You remember Minister Noonan said that write-offs are just they're a normal part of doing business. And that speaks to the reality of Irish society and how Irish society functions for the top 1% for whom write-offs are a normal part of doing business. But if you look at struggling people, mortgage holders who can't afford to pay their mortgages, write-offs are not a normal part of their life. They can't get access to write-offs. So the point is that it's write-offs for some, for the elites, for the 1%, and no write-offs for the rest of people. And it is a mechanism for a transference of wealth upwards, which is why we see the kind of accumulation of wealth we've seen over the course of the crisis. Top 300 people increasing their wealth by about 60%. Denis O'Brien doubling his wealth over the course of the crisis. It's precisely through mechanisms like this that they're able to achieve that. Thanks.